Dr. Evelyn Marlowe had spent her life studying ecosystems and wildlife patterns, but the forest she now found herself in was unlike any she had ever encountered. It was supposed to be teeming with life, deer, birds, insects, all part of the rich biodiversity. Instead, it was deathly quiet. The stillness was unnerving. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush, only the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. It felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. Evelyn frowned as she walked along the narrow trail, her boots sinking into the soft earth. She had come to this remote region to investigate reports of sudden, unexplained changes in the ecosystem. Rangers had mentioned that over the past few weeks animals had been disappearing, and locals were whispering about strange noises at night, low, mournful howls that carried through the trees. Evelyn had dismissed those as wolves or coyotes, but as she ventured deeper into the woods, a gnawing sense of dread began to settle in her stomach. The deeper she went, the stranger things became. The forest itself seemed to change, the trees growing larger and more gnarled, their branches twisting unnaturally. Moss clung to the trunks like a sickened skin, and the air became thick, almost oppressive, as though she were stepping into another world entirely. Evelyn's instincts, honed through years of research, told her that something was very wrong. She came to a clearing. At its center was something that immediately caught her attention. A circle of stones, ancient and weathered, arranged in a deliberate pattern. In the middle, the ground was blackened as though scorched by fire. It was a ritual site. She realized with a chill, but what kind of ritual, and why here, in the middle of this remote, forgotten forest? A distant howl echoed through the trees, low and mournful. This time, it sent a shiver down her spine. She knelt by the blackened earth, her fingers brushing the cold ground. The silence of the forest felt even more impressive now, as though they were closing in on her. Then she noticed something odd. The stones, each one was carved with strange, angular symbols she didn't recognize, symbols that pulsed faintly in the fading light of dusk. As she ran her fingers over one of the stones, she felt a sudden jolt, like a current of electricity, and pulled her hand back, heart pounding. Something was wrong here, something ancient and powerful. The howl came again, closer this time. Evelyn stood, her heart racing. She had come here to study nature, but this was something far beyond her field of expertise. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was watching her, and whatever lay dormant beneath this place was starting to awaken. The oppressive atmosphere only grew heavier as night fell. Evelyn set up camp cautiously, her senses heightened by the eerie silence. Her tent was pitched near the ancient stone circle, her lantern casting long, flickering shadows that glanced on the ground. Despite her best efforts to stay calm, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. After a fitful sleep, Evelyn awoke just before dawn to a faint glow emanating from the ritual site. Curious and cautious, she approached the stones, her heart pounding in her chest. The strange symbols carved into the stones were glowing faintly, almost pulsating with a life of their own. She knelt down, inspecting the center of the circle more closely. The ground was darker here, almost black. As she brushed aside the loose soil, she uncovered something shocking. Bones. Human bones. Evelyn gasped, recoiling instinctively. These remains were old, brittle, but unmistakably human. And then she noticed it. The pattern. The bones had been arranged in a deliberate, grotesque fashion, encircling a stone altar at the center. A sacrificial site. As she stood there piecing it together, a soft sound reached her ears, a faint, almost impenetrable breathing, as though the forest itself had come alive. But no, it wasn't the forest. It was something deeper, something more primal. She knelt again, her scientific mind overriding her fear. This site wasn't just old, it was ancient, older than any human settlement in the area. And the symbols, they weren't random. They told a story of transformation, of blood, and of the moon. The howl echoed again, sending chills down her spine. It was closer now, just beyond the tree line. Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat. She slowly turned, expecting to see an animal, a wolf perhaps. But what emerged from the trees was something far worse. A figure towering and covered in matted fur, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It moved with a terrifying grace, its body hunched and distorted, like something halfway between man and beast. A werewolf. Her rational mind rebelled against the sight, but there it was, standing before her. The creature didn't attack, though. It seemed hesitant, almost as though it were waiting for something. Evelyn's pulse raced as she slowly backed away, but then something strange happened. The creature's eyes, wild and animalistic, locked onto hers, and in that moment, she felt an odd connection, a flicker of recognition. This was no ordinary beast. This was human, or at least it had been. She stumbled back toward her camp, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The shrine, the site of sacrifice, it had once been used to turn a human into something else. something monstrous, and now, after centuries of slumber, it was starting to awaken. The next morning, Evelyn was already packing up her camp when she noticed something. One of the stones had shifted slightly during the night. It hadn't been there before. She was certain of it. It revealed a small recess in the earth, and inside, to her surprise, she found an old, crumbling scroll. The parchment was fragile, its edges disintegrating as she unrolled it carefully. The text was written in an ancient language she didn't recognize, but there were illustrations, images of the shrine, of the full moon, and of a figure kneeling before the altar, bound by ropes, a sacrifice. Her pulse quickened as she studied the drawings. The scroll depicted a transformation, a human becoming a beast, marked by the rise of a red moon. But there is more. Another illustration showed a different ritual, one that could reverse the transformation. It involved a wooden stake, a full moon, and something she hadn't expected, a red moon. As Evelyn studied the scroll, her thoughts whirled. Could this be what had happened here centuries ago? Had a human been sacrificed to become this thing? And more importantly, could the transformation be unknown? The howling in the distance had become a regular sound now, as if the creature was calling out to her, waiting for her to understand. She realized with sickening dread that this creature, this werewolf, had once been a man who had been trapped in this form for centuries, bound by the magic of this shrine. Her mind raced as she pieced together the details, the symbols, the sacrifice, the full moon. It all pointed to the creature being part of an ancient ritual that had been interrupted. The scroll suggested that the ritual could be reversed, but required a rare celestial event, a red moon, something that only happened once in a great while. As Evelyn sat back on her heels staring at the scroll, she realized what needed to be done. She had to find a way to perform the ritual. She had to help this creature, this man, return to his human form. But as she packed the scroll away, a new fear crept in. If she was right, and this werewolf had been imprisoned here for centuries, what would happen if he was freed? What kind of man would he be? Would he even want to return to the world of humans? The howl echoed again, low and mournful, as though urging her to hurry. Evelyn spent the next several days preparing. The scroll had been clear. The ritual could only be performed under a red moon, and the next one was fast approaching. She gathered the materials she needed, wood for the stake, herbs mentioned in the ritual, and supplies for a long night of waiting. As the day of the red moon drew closer, Evelyn found herself more and more connected to the creature. She hadn't seen him again since that first night, but the howling continued, each time growing more desperate, more human. It was as though he knew what she was planning, and he was waiting for her to release him. She could feel the pull of the ancient magic surrounding the shrine. The air was thick with it, buzzing just around the surface, like a storm waiting to break. The forest remained eerily silent, the animals long gone, but the presence of the creature lingered, as though the very trees were alive with his pain and his anger. Finally, the night of the red moon arrived. Evelyn stood in the clearing, the wooden stake clutched tightly in her hand. She had carved it herself, following the instructions from the scroll to the letter. The sky above was clear, the full moon shining down, but it wasn't the moon she was waiting for. It was the moment when the moon would turn red, a rare celestial event that would signal the time for the ritual to begin. She waited, heart pounding, as the minutes stretched into hours. The forest was unnervingly quiet, the only sound of the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees, and then, finally it happened. The moon began to change. Slowly, the bright silver disk was swallowed by a deep, blood-red hue. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the transformation took place, and Evelyn felt a surge of power rush through her. This was the moment. The ritual had to be completed now, or the opportunity would be lost. She approached the altar, the stake held firmly in her hand. The creature emerged from the trees, his glowing eyes locked onto hers. There was no aggression in his gaze this time, only a desperate, pleading look. He wanted this. He needed this. Evelyn raised the stake, her hands trembling. She wasn't sure what would happen once she plunged it into the ground at the center of the altar, but she had no choice. This was the only way to save him. With a deep breath, she drove the stake into the ground. As soon as the stake pierced the earth, the ground beneath Evelyn trembled, as though the forest itself was reacting to the ancient magic being reawakened. The symbols on the stone surrounding the altar began to glow, pulsing with an eerie red light that matched the color of the moon above. The werewolf staggered forward, his body convulsing as the magic took hold of him. He let out a deep guttural growl that quickly had turned into a pained roar. Evelyn could only watch in horror as the creature collapsed to the ground, his body withering and contorting, caught between his animal form and the man he once was. It was agonizing to watch, but Evelyn knew she couldn't stop. She had to see this through. The creature clawed at the ground, his massive frame trembling as the red light from the stone seemed to seep into his skin. His fur began to recede, his claws shrinking, his features slowly softening from the monstrous wolf-like visage to something more human. Evelyn held her breath, her heart racing. She could see it happening. The werewolf was transforming back into a human, but it wasn't happening as quickly as she hoped. The process was slow, painful, and filled with danger. The man trapped within the beast was fighting his way back, but the wolf wasn't giving up easily. The struggle between man and beast played out before her in a terrifying display of power and pain. The creature's eyes flickered between the wild, animalistic anger of the wolf and the softer, more human gaze of the man he had once been. Evelyn stepped forward, her heart pounding. "You can do this," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if he could hear her. "You can come back." The werewolf let out another roar, his body convulsing violently. For a moment, it seemed like the beast was winning, that the man would be lost forever to the curse that had held him captive for centuries. But then with one final desperate cry, the creature collapsed, his body going still. Evelyn held her breath, her hands shaking as she knelt beside him. The transformation had taken its toll. He was no longer the monstrous figure he had been, but a man lying unconscious on the forest floor. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his skin. It was warm, human. It had worked. Evelyn sat beside the unconscious man, her mind racing. He was no longer the terrifying creature that had stalked the forest. His body, though muscular and scarred, was unmistakably human. His face, now free of the grotesque snout and fangs, was rugged, with sharp features that spoke of a hard life. But he looked peaceful, almost as though the curse had lifted more than just a beastly form from him. She couldn't help but wonder who he had been before the curse, how long he had been trapped in that monstrous form, lurking in the shadows of the forsaken forest. The scroll had given no names, no real history, just a method to break the curse. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the trees, the man stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing deep, dark eyes that blinked in confusion. He sat up slowly, groaning as though every movement caused him pain. "Where am I?" his voice hoarse, barely more than a rasp. Evelyn knelt beside him, her heart pounding. "You're in the forest, near the shrine." The man frowned, his brow furrowing as he struggled to piece together his fragmented memories. The shrine, the sacrifice. His voice trailed off as his eyes widened in realization. He looked at Evelyn, his expression a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. You freed me?" Evelyn nodded, though she still didn't fully understand what she had done. "Yes, the scroll, it showed me how to reverse the curse." The man stared at her for a long moment, his eyes full of emotions she couldn't quite read. Finally he spoke, his voice trembling. "I've been trapped for centuries. The curse, it took everything from me. My life, my humanity." Evelyn swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. Centuries. This man had been alive for hundreds of years, forced to live as a monster, cut off from the world he had once known. "What's your name?" she asked softly. The man hesitated for a moment, as though he hadn't been asked that question in a long time. "Lucien," he finally said, his voice quiet. "My name is Lucien." Evelyn smiled gently. "I'm Evelyn." Lucien looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "I don't know how to thank you, Evelyn. You've given me back something I thought I had lost forever." Evelyn shook her head. "I just did what needed to be done. But what now? You've been gone for so long, the world is different now." Lucien nodded, his shadow passing over his face. "I know. I can feel it. Everything is strange, different." Evelyn reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to face it alone." Lucien looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "Thank you," he whispered. The sun had fully risen by the time Lucien and Evelyn made their way out of the forest. The air felt different now, lighter, as though the weight of centuries of dark magic had finally lifted. The birds had returned, their songs filling the once silent woods. Life was returning to the forest, just as Lucien had returned to his human form. As they walked, Evelyn couldn't help but glance at him every so often. He was quiet, his gaze distant, as though he was lost in his thoughts. She couldn't begin to imagine what it must be like for him, awakening in a world that had moved on without him. His old life long gone, but she had promised herself that she would help him, no matter what. "You'll have a lot to catch up on," Evelyn said softly, trying to break the silence. Lucien smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm not sure where to begin. Everything feels foreign, but I suppose that's the price of being cursed for so long." They reached the edge of the forest where Evelyn's car was parked. Lucien paused, staring at it with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "What is that?" Evelyn smiled, realizing how strange the modern world must seem to him. "It's a car. is how we get around. Lucien stared at the vehicle for a moment longer before nodding. A car, he repeated, as though trying to commit the word to memory. As they climbed into the car and began driving toward town, Evelyn felt a sense of calm settle over her. The forest was behind them, with it, the darkness of the shrine. But as she glanced over at Lucien, she knew that the real challenge lay ahead, helping him find his place in a world that had forgotten him. You saved me, Lucien said quietly, breaking the silence. I don't know why, but I owe you my life. Evelyn shook her head. You don't owe me anything, Lucien. I just couldn't leave you like that. Lucien looked out the window, his expression thoughtful. You could have walked away, but you didn't. Evelyn didn't know how to respond to that. She had acted on instinct, driven by a need to help him, even though she barely understood why. But now, as they drove toward an uncertain future, she realized that her connection to him ran deeper than she had anticipated. The road stretched ahead of them, long and winding, just like the journey they were about to embark on. But for the first time, Evelyn felt hopeful. They had faced the darkness together, and now they'll face whatever came next. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the world, Evelyn smiled to herself. A new dawn had begun, for both of them.